If you're wondering why I've got this big grin on my face, it's because I get to talk about one of my very favorite board games of all time, Mr. Jack, which is a game where one player plays as a criminal who has a secret identity and is trying to escape the clutches of the other player who plays as a police detective who is trying to find the identity of the criminal player and catch them before time runs out. So let me show you what this game is all about. One fun thing about Mr. Jack is it's not just an individual game, but there's a whole series of Mr. Jack games that consist of the original Mr. Jack base game. There's Mr. Jack the Carriage, a tiny little promo. There's the Mr. Jack extension, Mr. Jack Pocket, Mr. Jack in New York, and Le Fantôme de l'Opéra, which at first glance might not seem to fit in with the series, but as I go through them, you'll see why this is definitely a part of the whole Mr. Jack series of games. Before we dive into them, let me show you this fun little bit of artwork here with the base game and the extension box. So we have artwork that aligns when you put the edges of the two boxes together. We have an alleyway with a criminal fleeing down the alleyway. On these edges, the artwork aligns once again. And then we have the other end of the alleyway with the criminal running towards you. So that's just a bit of fun art based on the boxes of the games. Speaking of art, let me show you just how much I appreciate the Mr. Jack games. You see that clock at the top of the box? Well, yes, I got that clock tattooed on my shoulder, on my gaming tattoo, in appreciation for this game. So it's clear that I love Mr. Jack and all its related games. Let me dive into the specifics and show you what they're all about. When the original Mr. Jack was released in 2006, I think it became a fairly big hit fairly quickly. However, I avoided it for a while because of the theming of it. The whole Mr. Jack thing being related to Jack the Ripper didn't interest me at all. However, one day I won a free copy through a friendly local gaming store, and when I started to play the game, I realized just how much I was missing. And being interested in true crime, I decided at that point I would read up a little bit on the whole Jack the Ripper story. I figured, well, I've always been interested in detectives and mysteries and true crime, and this is, I guess, an unsolved mystery. So let me look into this and see what it's all about. And then I read a little bit and I was like, oh, the more I read it, I thought, yeah, so maybe this isn't something I'm all that interested in. Fortunately, after playing the game, I realized it really has nothing to do with Jack the Ripper other than some basic surface theme stuff. So fortunately, I was able to enjoy the game despite its sort of surface theming, which could have been related to any criminal, really. So what is it that makes this game so great? Well, rather than give you an extensive rules overview, I'm going to take you down here and show you the basics of the game, and hopefully you'll understand why I enjoy this game so much. The game board is set up as shown here, with each of the 8 characters in these positions on the board. Before the game begins, the Jack player has to take one set of 8 character cards, shuffle them up, and secretly choose one character card to be the identity of Jack. So in this case, I've chosen William Gull to be the secret identity of the Jack player. Next, the other stack of 8 character cards is all shuffled up, and 4 of the cards are turned face up, and these are the characters that are available to be used for the first turn. So on turn 1, the inspector player takes the first action. They're going to choose one of the 4 characters, and they're going to activate that character and potentially move them on the board. Then that character is going to be set aside, and the Jack player is going to in turn take first one character and then another character, and then the final character will be taken by the inspector player and activated on the board. At the end of the turn, the Jack player must declare whether their character is currently visible or not visible. Their character is visible if they are adjacent to another character or adjacent to a lit gas lamp here. In this case, I would have to announce that my character, if I was Jack, is not visible. This allows the inspector player now to remove several of the suspects who are visible because they're next to lamps or next to other characters. In this instance, they would now have me narrowed down to 3 possible suspects. Then the gas light labeled number 1 is going to be turned off and removed from the board, so that the game will get progressively darker as it goes on. At the end of turn 2, number 2 will come off, then 3, then 4. So the turn marker will advance to turn 2. The remaining 4 characters are going to be turned face up. And now the Jack player is going to choose one of the characters to move and activate. Then the inspector will choose one and then another one. And then the Jack player will choose another one. And again, the Jack player must now declare whether their character is visible or not visible. And then the next light is turned off and the turn order advances. At this point, all 8 character cards are now going to get shuffled back together. 4 will be turned up, and the game will then progress as normal in that manner up to a maximum of 8 turns. The player who is the inspector will win the game if before the end of the 8 turns they manage to move any character on top of the correct character, thus accusing them of being the criminal, in which case, if they were correct, if they chose the right character, they would win the game. There are a couple of ways in which the Jack player could win the game. If the Jack player is not visible, then they have an opportunity to walk out one of the exits that isn't blocked by the police barricade, and in so doing escape and immediately end the game. The other ways that they could win are if the inspector accuses the wrong character, or if turn 8 has arrived and perhaps the inspector player knows who the Jack player is, but has no way of getting to that character to accuse them during the final turn of the game, in which case the Jack player is considered to have escaped and wins the game. Now, the heart of the game are the special abilities that each of these 8 characters has. Very briefly, we'll go through each of them. I'm going to start off with the most powerful character, who is Sergeant Goodley. The reason he's so powerful is because before or after he moves, he's going to blow his whistle, which is then going to give him 3 movement points to move characters closer to him. So he could move one character 3 spaces closer to him, or 3 characters 1 space closer, and however he wants to divide up those 3 movement points, he has the potential to move up to 3 other characters in addition to himself. The other very powerful character is Sherlock Holmes, because after he moves, the player who chose to activate Holmes is going to get to draw a character card from the identity pile and secretly look at it. If the inspector drew this card, this is 1 fewer suspect that the inspector will potentially need to narrow down if it hasn't already been discovered that this is an innocent character. But the inspector is going to keep that secret so that the Jack player doesn't know which ones have been determined to be innocent or not. However, if it's the Jack player who has selected Sherlock Holmes, then the Jack player gets to take this card and look at it, and the Jack player will then know that this is a character that the inspector player cannot narrow down by drawing from the deck. So maybe they will pay extra close attention to keeping this character undiscovered during the course of the game. Miss Stealthy here is a potentially dangerous character for escaping the board because she has 4 movement points rather than the normal 3 that most of the other characters have. And in addition to that, she could walk through obstacles on the board that are normally impassable to the other characters. So she has a potential to walk off the board into an exit if she's not visible and make an escape of it. So she's a potentially dangerous one for escapes. Sir William Gull here has an ability where instead of moving, he can simply swap places with another character on the board. John Watson has a lantern that after you move John Watson, you decide which way he's facing, and that lantern's going to shine down a row of hexes and potentially illuminate or make characters visible who would not normally be visible. For instance, this character here is not next to a lit gas lamp or another character, so they would normally be in the dark, but the lantern from Watson here is going to illuminate that character and put them in the light. The remaining 3 characters affect the board itself. So Jeremy Burt here is going to move one of the manhole covers. The manhole covers provide a great way for characters to move quickly around the board, because for 1 movement point, they can go from 1 open manhole to any other open manhole on the board. However, there are 2 manhole covers that are always on the board, and Burt is the one that seals them up or opens them up, as the case may be, and thus affects characters to potentially move quickly around the board. John Smith here affects the gas lamps. So before or after moving John Smith, you get to move one of these lamps to another lamp location on the board, and thus again potentially putting characters in the light and making them visible who might not otherwise normally be visible. Finally, Inspector Lestrade here moves one of the barricades from an exit to another exit. And so the ones that Jack can potentially run off the board through are constantly changing as these barricades are moved around. So the game becomes a very chess-like brain burner in that each character has its own unique characteristics and abilities, and it can be a real brain burner trying to position them all to their best advantage depending on what the player is trying to accomplish. For instance, I find that in the early game, it's important for the Jack player to try to keep as many characters visible as possible while the lamps are all lit. It's easier to do that early in the game with fewer characters who are not visible. It makes it harder for the Inspector player to isolate characters and thus reduce the number of suspects that are available. However, as the lamps are snuffed out during the game, it becomes easier then at some point for the Jack player to try to spread out the characters and make them not visible, and in so doing potentially set them up for a late game escape off of the board. Now, the Mr. Jack base game isn't a completely balanced game. It is hard to win as the Jack player, particularly for new, inexperienced players. As players become experienced, then the win percentage has been shown to be roughly 60% wins for the Inspector player versus 40% for the Jack player. This is statistics that used to be kept when they had an excellent online implementation of Mr. Jack, which I'm very sad no longer exists. But when it did exist, I played it a lot, and for a time was proud of the fact that I was a highly ranked worldwide Mr. Jack player, for whatever that's worth, which is pretty much nothing. But anyways, they did have this website available and were able to keep the statistics, and thus able to determine that the Inspector players with experienced players would win about 60% of the time. Now, this is easy to get around by either giving an inexperienced or less experienced player the role of the Inspector, or just playing 2 games, swapping sides, and see who ends up winning more quickly as the Inspector player, if that's how it ends up playing out. Now, one thing that many players have complained about over the years is the fact that many games of Mr. Jack come down to 2 remaining suspects at the end of the game. With the final turn or 2 remaining, the Inspector needs to make an accusation of somebody rather than letting time run out and allowing Mr. Jack to escape. So they need to make an accusation, and players complain that this tendency to not eliminate all the suspects makes it so that the Inspector might have, for instance, a 50-50 chance of just making a guess at the end of the game and either winning or losing based on a 50-50 flip of the coin. However, I've always argued that that's where the true deduction of the game comes in. The Inspector player has to watch how the Jack player is choosing characters, which characters are being chosen, and how they are moved, and in so doing, perhaps have a strong suspicion of one of the characters over another if it comes down to that final guess between the 2 characters. I like the fact that you have to read the other player's play, and that is part of winning the game as the Inspector. So with this base game, I have dozens and dozens of plays, both with the physical version of the game and online. And even though the setup never changes, I never got tired of it. There was so much variability in the selection of which character the Jack player was going to be. As the Jack player, the game plays different based on which character you are on the board and their associated abilities. And then for the Inspector, regardless of who it is, you're always trying to split those characters up into roughly half visible and half not visible in order to eliminate as many suspects as possible at once. I've compared this game to a cross between Clue and chess. I always loved Clue when I was a kid, and that whole deduction and being able to be a detective is something that always appealed strongly to me. And then you combine that with that chess-like movement and manipulation of the pieces on the board, and it's really a great combination for me personally. But even though I never got tired of this static setup and the start of the game being the same each time, along came Mr. Jack Extension and Mr. Jack the Carriage and really threw things for a loop. Let's get into those next. In 2006, the same year that the base game was released, Mr. Jack the Carriage was a little promo that I think appeared in a magazine somewhere. So it was a very limited print run promo as far as I know, but I found it very easy to incorporate into the game just by making the single carriage token and downloading the rules. Now, the carriage comes into play when it is chosen by a player instead of one of the 4 available characters for the turn. The character can be chosen in place of either the first, second, or third character choice, but not in place of the final character choice. If the character is chosen, the player who chooses it will choose one of the characters to remove, and instead of activating that character, will then move the carriage from 1 to 8 spaces on the board. As the carriage moves, it can potentially pick up characters and drop them off as it goes around the board. With 8 movement points, the carriage can potentially have a very large impact on the state of the board. And as a result, I find it really brain-burning to use because it's hard enough trying to anticipate the board state after 4 characters have activated their abilities and moved on the board, let alone this carriage that has 8 movement points that can potentially move a whole bunch of characters in the process. Now, the character can only move once per game turn, but it's still over the course of 8 potential turns, a lot of movement that happens and has a pretty large impact on the game. However, for those who are looking to step up the level of the gameplay, that is one potential easy implementation that adds yet another puzzle on top of everything else that's going on in the base game. Now, the extension, on the other hand, let me get that in here and show you how that works. In 2007, the expansion for Mr. Jack, called Mr. Jack Extension, was released. It introduced 5 new characters who can potentially come into the game. Now, the game is always played with 4 of the original 8 characters, the 3 characters who affect the board state, and Sherlock Holmes. The other 4 characters are mixed with the 5 characters of the extension and shuffled together. The Jack player is dealt 5 of those cards, and the Inspector player is dealt 4 of those cards. Each player has to choose 2 characters to introduce to the game to go along with the 4 from the base game. And that way there will always be 8 characters involved with the game. Now, the special abilities of the extension characters are interesting. With these 2, there's a particular potential for escape, because Madam's ability here is that she can move 6 movement spaces instead of the normal 3. However, she can only walk on roads and is not permitted to use sewer movement, not with that nice dress she's wearing anyways. Spring-Heeled Man here has the ability to leap with his movement. So his movement is normally 3, but he can leap over obstructions on the board. He can also leap over individual characters in a symmetric manner. So if one character is 2 spaces away from him, he can leap to 2 spaces past that character. He can't go over 2 characters at once, but you can see how far this character could travel with 3 movement points. John Pizer here affects the movement of other characters. So after he moves, if he is next to another character, that character has to move 3 spaces away from him. Inspector Aberline here, whose name didn't get printed on his card, has the opposite sort of ability, whereby any character that starts adjacent to Inspector Aberline is so caught up with the inspector's questioning that that character only has 1 point of movement available when that character is chosen. So Inspector Abberline could really take away the movement abilities of the Madam or Spring-Heeled Man, for instance, because it reduces their movement capabilities to 1 if they start next to the Inspector. And then finally we have Joseph Lane, our no gods, no masters fellow who builds the barricades. So before or after he moves, he puts up a barricade on the board. Now characters who are on opposite sides of a barricade cannot see each other, so they do not make each other visible for the sake of light and dark visibility. And that barricade becomes impassable. It becomes an obstruction on the board, even for Spring-Heeled Man or for Miss Stealthy. You can normally move through obstacles. As if all those exciting new characters wasn't enough, now the whole setup of the game is changed. No longer is it a static setup that remains the same each game, but there is now a setup phase prior to starting the game where the Inspector and the Jack player take turns selecting a character and placing it on any street map of the board as its starting position. So yes, the Jack player can say, yeah, I'm going to start this character right next to the exit, but then the Inspector player can then plop down another character next to them and say, well, they're not going anywhere for a while. Because regardless of how all the characters are placed in that setup, the light darkness card always starts on the light visible side, meaning that no character can escape from the board on the first turn of the game. Rather, the Jack player would have to get their character into a not visible location on turn 1, and then somehow get them to escape the board on a future turn. But this ability to start characters literally anywhere you want on the board really makes for quite a different gameplay experience each time. Like I said, it would be tempting for the Jack player to start their characters by all 4 exits. However, that also gives the Inspector player an option to maybe rule out suspects very quickly, as opposed to if the Jack player had decided to clump them all together in the middle of the board and try to keep everybody together at the beginning of the game. It might be much more difficult for the Inspector to reveal suspects by splitting them apart. So there's certainly some strategy involved even with that initial setup of the extension game. But as good and exciting as all that is, my very favorite version of Mr. Jack didn't come along until 2009 when Mr. Jack in New York was released. So let me get this one set up and show you what this is all about. Mr. Jack in New York is one of only 4 games that I rate 10 out of 10, although, to be honest, the base game is a game that I rate 9 out of 10, so it's not that huge a leap, but it's also my number 3 ranked game of all time. However, since the 2 games that are above it, Gloomhaven and War of the Ring, are massive monster games, it's pretty fair to say that this is the number 1 smaller, lighter game of all time for me. Let's dive into it and see why it's so special. For those who are familiar with the original Mr. Jack, learning the New York version is going to be a piece of cake. It's all the same structure. The Jack player starts by getting their secret identity. Each turn 4 character cards are turned face up. The Inspector and Jack player take turns taking those characters and activating them. At the end of each turn, Jack reveals whether they are currently visible or not visible. And everything about the gameplay itself is very much the same in that manner. However, the first thing you notice is that the game is wide open. There are minimal obstructions, or really not much at all on the map to begin with, which makes the game very open-ended and dynamic, and there's a lot of strategic complexity built into it. As the game progresses, the characters that are activated are going to build up the map itself in a very open-ended fashion, so it's going to be really much up to the players to determine how the city of New York here gets constructed. In fact, 6 out of the 8 characters in the game affect the physical makeup of the map, and we'll go through each of them in turn, starting with Louis Latimer. Before or after he moves, Louis must take a street lamp and place it anywhere on the board that isn't adjacent to an existing street lamp. So in that way, each time he comes up, more street lamps will be added. Alfred Beach, before or after he moves, is going to place a new metro station on the board that isn't adjacent to an existing metro station. These act in the same manner as the sewer entrances did in the original game, in that players can use one point of movement to move from one metro station to another. Cloud Rider, before or after she moves, is going to build another building on the board, which act as obstructions for most characters. However, her other special ability is that when she moves, she can move through all buildings with a single action point. So for instance, she can move from this space on the board, and with one action point go 1, 2, 3, for instance. So she is a very mobile character in the New York edition. And then James Callahan is the one that controls these barricades. So unlike in the original version where the barricades were only at the 4 exits, the barricades in this version can be literally placed anywhere on the map to block 2 hexes. While I'm at it, I'll mention that the way that Mr. Jack escapes in this version is either through the land exit, which is this one spot on the board where the Jack player can escape, or by getting to one of the boats. So as long as the entrance to the boat isn't blocked, a character that's in the dark, not visible, could walk onto the boat and then win the game by escaping in that manner. Now getting to the next 4 characters. Mrs. Emma Grant affects the map by turning locations into parks. Each of the tiles in the game, whether they be street lamps, subway stations, or buildings, on the reverse side show a park symbol. So before or after she moves, Mrs. Grant can take one of these tiles and flip them over to make it into a park. In that way, she can perhaps turn out a lamp or reduce the number of subway entrances, and also a character who's in a park is not visible to anybody else, even if another character is next to them. So if a character was standing, for instance, on a metro station entrance, and they are normally visible by being next to another character, if Emma uses her ability to turn this into a park, all of a sudden neither of these characters are currently visible to anybody, even though the park is next to a lamp as well. Now Edward Smith, our captain here, is the one that moves the boats. So when he moves, he has to take one of the boats and move them to one of the other pier locations that are marked in the red outline here. So the escape routes to the Jack player are constantly on the move thanks to the captain. Now the final 2 characters are characters who affect the movement of other characters. Monk Eastman, instead of moving, can potentially move another character. So if Monk Eastman is currently not visible, as he is in this case, he can take another non-visible character and move that character 1 to 3 spaces instead of moving himself. Conversely, if he's currently visible, he can, instead of doing his movement, move another character who is currently visible 1 to 3 spaces. And then finally, Francis Tumblety, before or after he moves, can take a character that is currently adjacent to him and swap that character's position with any other character on the board. The one other difference with the New York edition is the way in suspects are revealed. With the original Jack, we had Sherlock Holmes, who could be selected as a character and then one of the characters revealed from the pile. However, in this case, a character has to visit the snitch in order to reveal a potential suspect. So the snitch starts the game on the island here, which can be accessed from one of these 3 dark spaces on the board. If a character uses a movement to land on the snitch, then the snitch will allow that character to draw from the suspect pile and secretly look at it. So in the same manner as with Sherlock Holmes, if Mr. Jack character reveals the suspect character, that's kept secret so that the investigator doesn't know which character has been revealed there. Whereas if the investigator picks up this card, then they have 1 fewer suspect to worry about eliminating. And then the character who went to the snitch will then take the snitch and place them anywhere else on the map with the red X side up until the end of the turn, at which point the snitch will become available again. The red X simply means that nobody else can visit the snitch for the rest of the turn. In addition to that, a character that's way up in the island here cannot be made visible in any way whatsoever, so they are always not visible when they're up in the island. With so much about how the board is built and developed being left in the hands of the players, it really adds to the brain burn of the Mr. Jack experience. And so as a result of that small ramp up in the complexity of strategic options, I give Mr. Jack in New York the edge over all the other versions. And now the next version we're going to discuss came out the following year in 2010, and it shrunk down to a tiny little pocket edition. In fact, Mr. Jack Pocket is the next edition that I'm going to look into here. With Mr. Jack Pocket, the familiar system has been brilliantly reimagined by the same design pair of Bruno Cathala and Ludovic Maublanc. Once again, we have a situation where the Mr. Jack player must take their secret identity from a deck of alibi cards, and that will be their identity for the game. However, in this version of the game, the characters on the board do not move. Rather, we have 3 characters that are going to be moving around the outside of the board. We have Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, and their dog Toby. We also have 4 action tokens which are going to dictate the flow of play. And here's a unique situation where you actually roll tokens in the game. Now, I shouldn't have rolled those on the map itself, because now I've messed everything up. But the 4 action tokens represent the actions that will be available for the turn. On turn 1, the inspector is going to start by choosing one of the 4 actions, doing that action. Then the Jack player will choose first one and then another, and then the inspector will choose the 4th. Then the following turn, they will all be flipped over. And starting with the Jack player, Jack will choose one, then the inspector will choose one and then another, and then the Jack player will choose the 4th one. And then again, on the 3rd turn, everything's going to get shuffled up again and thrown back on the table to see what is available for the next selection of actions. Now, a few of these action tokens represent the characters who are moving around the outside of the board. So, if a player chooses the Holmes action token, they have to move the Holmes character either 1 space or 2 spaces clockwise around the edge of the map. Similarly, if they choose Watson, they will move the Watson token either 1 space or 2 spaces clockwise around the map. If they choose the sort of wildcard token, if the inspector chooses it, they have to choose to move one of the 3 characters a single space clockwise around the map. If the Jack player chooses it, they can choose to move nobody or move one of the characters 1 space around the edge. There are 2 tokens that have rotate a tile on them, which will allow a player to choose a tile and change the orientation of that tile to a different orientation. If both rotations come up on the same turn, the player cannot then rotate the original tile again. They have to choose a different one to rotate this time. And they will change the orientation of it. And then the final way to move tiles is with the swap a tile action, which will allow players to take 2 of the tiles on the map without changing their orientation and swap their positions. The final action option is for a player to look at one of the alibi cards. Before I get into the specifics of that, I will mention that just as with the original Mr. Jack, at the end of each game turn, the Jack player has to announce whether their secret character is currently visible or not visible. If it was set up like this, the character is currently visible because a street connects one of the outside characters to the secret character. So in this case, the Jack player would announce that their player is visible, which means that any character on the board that is not visible gets flipped over. So this whole row of characters is connected by the street, so they are visible by Toby. These 3 are also visible by Watson, which means that we would flip over the characters who are not currently seen by any of the 3 characters that are on the outside of the map. Now the investigator has narrowed down the total number of suspects. If on the next turn they announce that their character is not visible, then we would have to do the opposite. We would have to flip over all of the characters that are currently visible from the outside of the map by one of the 3 characters. In the case of Joseph Lane here, when we flip this card over, it becomes a 4-way street rather than its normal T intersection. So that kind of changes the outlook of the map a little bit, particularly once you start rotating tiles to other locations. Unlike the original Mr. Jack, where you don't have to have all suspects revealed and get it down to a single suspect before you can accuse somebody, in this version of the game, the inspector can only win if there is a single character still revealed before the 8 turns are up. If we get to the end of the 8th turn and there are still more than 1 suspect face up, then the Jack player wins the game. However, the Jack player can also win the game by collecting 6 hourglasses before the end of the 8th turn. Now, the way they collect hourglasses are by being not visible at the end of a turn. So in this case, where my character is not visible at the end of a turn, I would get to take the turn token, which has an hourglass on the reverse side of that, and put that in front of me as one of the 6 hourglasses I need to collect. If at the end of a turn my character is visible, the turn token just gets set aside and that hourglass is not collected. Now, the other way, getting back to this token, that hourglasses can be collected is if the Jack player takes that token action and takes a card into their hand. Each of the characters has an hourglass in the corner. Now, there are a couple of exceptions. One character has no hourglasses, and one character has 2 hourglasses. The rest have 1 hourglass. So every time the Jack player secretly collects an alibi card with this token to keep that face down, and the inspector doesn't know exactly how many hourglasses the Jack player has collected. If the investigator player takes this action token, they will actually reveal the card, and if that character is still face up, they will simply turn that tile over, and they have denied the Jack player another precious hourglass that they need to get towards the 6 for an early win in the game. So that's an interesting wrinkle in that the investigator, as long as Jack is collecting these cards, never is quite sure how many hourglasses the Jack player has until they get to 6 and reveal that they have won the game, potentially. This is an unassuming little game that does come in an unassuming little pocket-sized box, and yet it has all the brain-burning tension of the original Mr. Jack versions. It's amazing how much time you can spend just puzzling over how the actions are going to interplay with each other and how best to set yourself up for success in the game. I've played this one a number of times in person. However, I've played most of my games on my phone, actually. There's an app version of Mr. Jack Pocket that's really well done, and I have well over 100 plays on the app version on my phone as a solo version, and it's quite challenging in the hard AI mode, so it's definitely one that presents a good challenge even after well over 100 plays. But this isn't the end of the brilliance of Messieurs Maublanc and Catala, because I still have to talk about Le Fantôme de l'Opéra. Check this out. For Josh, wish you a lot of fun with this game. All the best, Bruno. That's right, Bruno Catala himself autographed my copy of the game, thanks to a friend who brought it to Gen Con for me one year. Anyways, Le Fantôme de l'Opéra could very well be in the same series of Mr. Jack games. You'll see in a minute that the very familiar framework is there, and that it's just another reimagining of the same system. However, I do find this game to be the most approachable of all the games in the series, and it's the one that's easiest to get newcomers into the system with, and there's a couple reasons for that which will become clear as we go over the game itself. So let's get into that. This time our setting is an opera house where 8 characters inhabit rooms that are connected via regular passageways, these gold-colored ones that connect them around in a big circle as well as straight through the center. And there are also secret passageways, the ones in pink here, that cannot be used by most of the characters. In familiar fashion, the player who plays as the Phantom will draw their secret identity from the deck of suspects. In this case, I've drawn the black character, Christine Daae. But then this time around, 3 Phantom cards are going to be shuffled into the deck of suspects before play begins. Let's pretend those are shuffled in there. Then the character cards are going to be shuffled up and 4 will be put out in the display. As usual, the inspector is going to have first choice at taking one of the characters and activating them, and then the Phantom player will choose first one and then another, and then the inspector will choose another, and then we'll get our next 4. The old pattern that you're familiar with by now. The goal of the Phantom in this game is to scare La Carlotta away by having her reach the end of this track here, whereas the goal of the Inspector is to reveal the identity of the Phantom before La Carlotta leaves the opera. So in typical fashion, every turn after the 4 characters have been activated and moved around the board, Let's say, for example, it looks somewhat like this. The Phantom player will announce whether their character is currently visible or not visible. In this instance, their character is visible if they are in a room with another character where the light has not been turned off. So there is one token that always has a light off in a room somewhere on the board. But for the remainder of the rooms, as long as at least one other character is in the room, that player is visible. In this instance, my character would be not visible since they are in a room alone, which means that the only two visible characters are revealed to not be suspects any longer. Then once that's finished, the number of remaining characters who are still suspects indicates the distance that La Carlotta will move towards the end of the track. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 unrevealed characters still. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In that way, she moves alarmingly quickly from the perspective of the investigator at the beginning of the game until more of these suspects are revealed to be innocent, at which case she'll finally start slowing down towards the end there. But as usual, let's dive into the special abilities of the characters here, starting with Meg Geary. Her special ability is she can use the pink passageways and in so doing potentially cover a lot of distance with a single move. Now, unlike with other versions of Mr. Jack where a standard movement is 3 movement points, in this version of the game it's a very interesting system whereby the distance a character can move is equal to the total number of characters that are currently in their room at the start of their turn. So here we have 2 characters are in this room, so this character's movement ability is 2 spaces. So she could go 1, 2 for instance, or 1, 2, and then when the next character is selected, they might have 3 movement points by moving that character into the room before the next character takes their turn. So you can really affect the mobility and the distance that different characters can move by either grouping them together or spreading them out more. So Meg's ability is she can move quite far distances using the pink passageways, and she's the only character that can use the pink ones. All the rest of the characters have to use the gold colored passageways. Monsieur Richard here, instead of moving, can simply switch places with any character on the board. We've seen that ability in other versions of Mr. Jack, so that's pretty straightforward. Joseph Bouquet here, before or after he moves, has to turn out the light of any of the rooms on the map. It doesn't have to be the room that he ends up in, but you can just turn off the lights so that characters all of a sudden who are in the same room are not visible, whereby previously they might have been visible. And then Madame Geary here has a lock that allows her to lock one of the passageways, so that becomes impassable to all characters. Either before or after she moves, she can lock the passageway, so she could potentially leave a room and then lock the passage behind her to isolate herself perhaps. Now moving on to the 4 remaining characters. Raoul de Chagny is the one, like Sherlock Holmes, who gets to draw from the suspect deck. If the Phantom player draws this card, the Phantom player keeps it secretly to prevent the inspector knowing which character might potentially be innocent or not. If the Phantom draws a Phantom card from this deck, then they get to reveal it and move La Carlotta forward 1 to advance her towards the running away space more quickly. Conversely, if the Inspector player activates that character, they will draw from the deck and reveal the card. If this character has not been revealed as innocent yet, that character will be immediately flipped over and then that card set aside. If the Inspector player draws a Phantom card from the deck, then they will get to move La Carlotta 1 back further away from getting to the end of the track there. Our next 2 characters are sort of opposites of each other. Christine Daae here, when she finishes her move, will attract all characters from adjacent connected rooms to her room. So if she ends here, she'll draw in these 2 from this room, this one from this room. Whereas Monsieur Moncharmin, when he walks into a room, when he's finished his movement, will chase away everybody outside of the room into neighboring rooms. And the character that activated him gets to decide how those characters are split up, whether they all move together or maybe one is isolated, the others are kept together, however they want to strategically work that out. And then finally, a character known simply as the Persian gets to take a character with him when he moves if a character starts in the same room as him. So in this case, he starts in our room with 2 other characters, so his movement value is 3. He can pick up one of those characters and move up to 3 spaces. He could go 1, 2, 3, and drop that character off in any room that he likes, or take that character with him for the full distance. Then, as I said, the whole revealed or not revealed happens, and then La Carlotta is moved forward according to the number of unrevealed suspects. The investigator must get all the suspects down to 1 final remaining suspect in order to win the game before La Carlotta reaches the end of this track here. So that's a very straightforward system, and the other really nice thing about it is there's a built-in balancing mechanism where if you're playing with 2 characters of unequal skill or experience, you can start La Carlotta either closer to the end of the track to help the Phantom player, or further away from the end of the track to help the Inspector player. I really like that self-balancing mechanism where, unlike the original Mr. Jack, you have a situation where the Jack player can be really at a disadvantage if the player is inexperienced. So Le Fantôme, which was a 2013 release, is just really approachable and easy to balance, and it's the one that I find myself turning to if I'm a little more tired and just want to set up quickly and don't want quite the fiddliness and brain burn of one of the other editions of Mr. Jack. So I hope I've been able to convey why I'm so enthusiastic about this whole series of games, which have quite a simple rule set, but create just quite a tense and thinky experience that's fun whether you're the criminal trying to be sneaky and escape, or the inspector trying to deduce which is the criminal you're actually trying to come after. It's also why I'm trying so hard to find a game called Verona Twist that is very heavily inspired by the Mr. Jack system. It's the only game that isn't designed by Ludovic Maublanc and Bruno Catala, yet is inspired by the Mr. Jack framework of games. I think it was released by a Romanian company, and so it's pretty much impossible to find anywhere in North America, but I'd love to get hold of Verona Twist as well to see what that one's all about. But in the meantime, I have just a ton of fun games here. Combined, these are definitely one of my most played games, especially if you count the online or iOS versions of the game. I definitely have hundreds of plays between all of these games. Do let me know what you think in the comments below, and thanks for sticking through this one with me. Holy cow, you made it to the end of this video! That really does mean a lot to me. The other thing that means a lot to me is if you would give it a thumb up, or subscribe to my channel, or maybe share this video with one person that you think would enjoy it. Cheers! There's Mr. Jack, and all the games that relate are, well, I like crime. Well, I'm interested in true crime. I have an interest. The game board is shut up. Closer to goodly has a lantern that when after but as good and exciting as all that is, it doesn't compare. But as good and so let me get this shut. Mr. Jack in New York is one of only 4 games that I rate 10 out of 10. Mr. Jack in New York. I'll look to the box. And then finally, Francis Tumblety is, and then in fact, you'll see that it has all the very similar. And in fact, you'll see that it has all the very similar. Oh boy. Oh geez.